So welcome back to Boys on Film Halloween special today. We are taking a look at some of the essential Halloween films for, well, not just for horror fans, but for people that don't necessarily know a lot of the films that we're featuring on the list. My name is Phil Marriott, and I'm delighted to welcome a very special guest today, who's Matt Keppel, who is one half of the electronic duo MICROFILM. Matt, how are you doing?
I'm doing well.
So Halloween season, you've written a list of your favourite films, 50 top films. I've got to say, most of these I've watched, and your list is almost identical to some of my favourite films as well, which is kind of spooky, but there are a few on there that I haven't seen, so I thought we could pick out a few of these films. But before we do that, let's talk about your music, because I was listening to your amazing cover version of The Cure's All Cats Are Grey today. Tell us about MICROFILM and how you started the band.
Sure, we started it in, I'm in the band with my husband, who's also my musical partner. Started off as boyfriends, then eventually got married. We started a long time ago, 2006, and we've released 7 albums so far. So our 7th album just came out about 2 weeks ago. It's called OVNI, or OVNI, which is another version of saying UFO. It's a Romance language version of saying it. So it's an album about space travel and the idea of being someone in space for a long period of time, kind of getting lost in that experience, and the kind of idea of like loneliness and in isolation of being someone on a ship, maybe with a couple other people for years, and never seeing anyone else and wondering if you're ever going to get back home. So it's a bit of a gloomy space exploration story. I mentioned your cover of All Cats Are Grey as well, the Cure song from the Faith album, and I love it because it's really faithful, but it sounds really soundtracky as well. I was going to say it sounds a bit like John Carpenter's soundtracks, but that would kind of imply that you're copying his style, but it's not, because it does sound like you're doing it. But it has that kind of sci-fi vibe about it, which I really like, which suits the song, I think. It suits the original. Yeah, thanks. I mean, we're big fans of John Carpenter and kind of film scores in general. And this album has a lot of score elements because a lot of it is instrumental, so it has that vibe of soundtracking some kind of space exploration or some kind of melancholy, maybe darker vibe that you'd find in like a sci-fi movie or some kind of thriller. And
I guess The Cure's original sounds a little bit like John Carpenter as well in places.
Yeah, I mean, that album is great. Something from that album, speaking of horror, a Cure song is in a new American Horror Story, something from Faith. The title track, Faith, is in it. So it has like a gloomy kind of like place setting kind of experience.
Because that's set in the early 80s. You were talking about it just before we started recording, because I haven't seen it yet, but I really need to see it. But have you seen the whole thing?
No, it's kind of a weekly thing, so they only have maybe 2 episodes out so far. It's schlocky, but it's like fun. I mean, I think a lot of his series are pretty schlocky, but you're in it for the horror as well as in for the kind of campiness and the kind of finding out what his influences are and kind of inspirations.
Were you quite young when you first got into horror? Because I think I was about 9, 8 or 9.
I think I was, because my parents were pretty liberal as far as like media, like music and film. Like they didn't censor anything. Like, watch whatever you want to, you know. We're not going to pay attention to what you're watching. And we had cable pretty young. Maybe I was about 10 or 11. So you'd watch R-rated horror movies. I think it's probably 18 and Title 18 in the UK. I think the first R-rated movie I saw was Psycho 2, and I think I went to the theater with my dad and my brother, and we saw that. And I was probably 10 years old, 10 or 11. So
wow, I love that. Your parents sound like mine, like really relaxed about it. They didn't mind that I was watching stuff on TV as well.
There wasn't monitoring, and I think they trusted their children's judgment about what they're seeing, and it wasn't going to turn them into a serial killer. So
my older brother was really into horror as well, so he would tease me at night. I remember when we saw Salem's Lot, and we used to share a bedroom, and we had no curtains over the window at one point. And he would do the voice, you know, the tapping on the window, let me in, and scratching on the window. I used to be terrified. I was probably only about 8 or 9 at that time.
Yeah, and I think a lot of horror films that you saw when you were probably 10 or 11, which were incredibly scary at that time, you'd see them now. Something like the Amityville Horror, like the first one, is not really scary. It's kind of schlocky and cheesy, but at the time, it's like the most terrifying thing you've ever seen. That or Poltergeist just seems very crazy when you're 10 years old.
It's funny you mentioned the Amityville Horror, because that's one film that I've picked out. I've just selected a few films that, not necessarily films that I've seen, but films that resonated with me for some reason, because it's a really strong list of 50 films. Obviously, we don't have time to go through every one, but maybe we can come back and do a second part, maybe next year, and you've probably revised the list by then. There might be a few newer films that you've seen that
Definitely.
you could probably update the list. But we'll start with number 50, Terror Train. This is a film with Jamie Lee Curtis, who, of course, the Scream Queen from Halloween. Tell us about Terror Train, because I still haven't seen it to this day.
It's a Jamie Lee Curtis kind of Scream Queen thing that came out after. She did like a bunch of them really rapidly, maybe a couple a year around that time. And so I think it kind of got lost, and people probably thought it was like a dumb film because it came out at the same time as Prom Night, and Prom Night's a pretty silly movie. It's not great. But Terror Train has a lot more to it, a lot more thrills than you would think it would. Obviously it takes place on a train, a bunch of college kids going on a train through Canada, I think, in the wintertime. For whatever reason, they don't really explain why. And it's like a costume party, and David, you know who David Copperfield is? The magician from the 70s?
Yeah.
He's on the train too, being the entertainment on the train, because college kids apparently want to see a magician doing, card tricks and dumb stuff like that. No, they don't, but it's in the film, and Jamie's just kind of bopping around, doing her thing, hanging with her boyfriend and stuff like that. I mean, it's a slasher film, so there's not much to it. But being enclosed in a train situation, there's no way to escape, and there's very few, places you can be in the train. So it makes it a really interesting kind of experience on how can someone get away with all the stuff in such an enclosed environment. There's some silly scares, but there are a few kind of when she's one-on-one with the killer, kind of intense, scary scenes.
We were going to do this video with Sean, who of course hates horror. Yeah. I mean, if anyone's watched any of our previous videos with Sean, we've done reviews of a couple of horror films. One was The Innocents more recently, but there have been a couple of others. Saint Maud, I think, was another one, and he really liked that. So I think he does like certain horror films. Is this the sort of thing that he would like, or
does he like slashers? Does he like Halloween and the kind of slasher stuff?
But is it something that he would laugh at? I mean, you say it's quite kind of ridiculous and schlocky. Is it?
It's definitely, because if you go, it's very 1980, bad hair, bad fluffy men's hair, and like
quite camp.
Oh, very, 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 very much so. Costume parties on a train in 1980. It's kind of silly. I'm surprised he likes Saint Maud. What's Sean's secret of things he likes versus things he doesn't like as far as horror?
See, that's such a good question, because I think he's a bit of an oddball. I think, and I mean that, in the nicest term possible, because I'm sure that he would like more horror films. I just think that he's so put off by the thought of being terrified. But I think there are a lot of films that would terrify him, but in a different way, maybe more intellectually rather than just kind of stabby stuff.
Yeah, I'm curious to figure out, to have him go through that list and with a pen and be like, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, and kind of cut stuff off.
That could be the next challenge. I think we need to get him back on and go through this list. So we mentioned the Amityville Horror. 1979 this came out. I remember seeing this at a really young age and being completely terrified by it. I mean, there's one scene that stands out in my mind is when the priest guy that's in one of the bedrooms and he hears the demon's voice saying, "Get out." Don't you see lots of flies at the window? It's been years since I've seen this film. I can't remember.
Yeah, it is a priest, and he's covered. He can't get out of the room somehow, and all these flies somehow get in the room. So he's covered in flies and trying to get out of the door, and it's locked, and he can't get out. And I forget what happens to him. Maybe he dies in the room or something, but
it's Rod Steiger, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is.
But I know that it's not necessarily a film that's always in the lists of the best horror films ever. I think on Rotten Tomatoes it's got quite a low score, isn't it?
It's not like Terror Train, but it's got that schlocky element where
nothing's like Terror Train.
Right. It's supposed to be scary, but it's kind of bad at special effects, so it looks just kind of cheap and kind of silly. So it's not scaring you as you think it should. But when you're 10 years old, it's terrifying to watch, black oil drip down the wall. That's probably a cheap effect. But when you're 10, you're like, oh my God, this is like the scariest thing I've ever seen. There's a scary scene in that movie, though, when he goes into the basement, remember? And there's like a secret room that he breaks into, breaks down a wall, and it's like a blood room or something. That's That's the only kind of freaky thing I remember from that film. I haven't seen it in ages, but
I need to revisit that. 36 Psycho. I mean, this is one of my favourite films. This is actually in my top 10 because I think it's such an amazing film. I mean, like many Alfred Hitchcock movies, it really is a memorable horror movie. And I think, you know, when it was made, what was it, 1960, I think, wasn't it? It's just really stood the test of time.
It's a movie that's not scary. I guess to a modern audience, it's not very scary because it's pretty not gory. It's just kind of more of a psychological story. But I'm sure, especially at the time, it was terrifying, you know, because audience weren't used to horror movies like that. Either psychological horror movies or like the shower scene was probably crazy to 1960s audience. I mean, to now, if you just saw that in a movie, you'd be like, oh, okay, whatever. But back then it was like, people are probably like fainting in the theater or something. I think it was probably a great and probably terrible experience for Anthony Perkins, I'm assuming, where he did this fantastic job playing this super complex, well-written character that then typecast him for the rest of his life, and he probably never got a role again that wasn't playing some kind of creepy or odd character, because I think it did. I think every role he did after that was just like, he was a weirdo in it, you know? But that's
so true.
That's an indelible horror movie, right? To have some character be such a strong character that they're implanted in your brain as that person forever.
So 33, another one of my faves, Kill List. I remember going to see this at the cinema with my friend Claire. I just remember shaking coming out of seeing this film, this screening, because it really rattled me. It shook me to the core, this film, and not many modern horror films do that, and this one really did. Quite brutal.
Yeah, I thought the same thing. There was another movie, I think it was a friend who recommended Inside, that we talked about earlier. Maybe that was before we started recording. Recommended Kill List, knew nothing about it, went in to see it with my husband, and was so terrified. I mean, it starts off as like, there's not a lot of gore, I think, in most of the movie, but it has this perfect sense of dread that just kind of starts building from the beginning. It just gets stronger and stronger, where you know something terrible is going to happen, but you just don't know what it is or when it is. And that just builds and builds and builds until the end of the film, where I'm not going to say what happens, but there's a big climax, obviously, at the end of the film where it just gets really horrific and bleak and kind of scary all at once.
Bleak is a really good word to describe Kill List. It feels really bleak, but obviously the end of it does go off into kind of folk horror territory, because obviously the beginning starts off like a crime thriller, and a really hard-hitting crime thriller. I mean, it's violent, but yeah, towards the end you see the more horror elements. I suppose, you know, crime drama, crime thrillers are horrors as well, but specifically I think it started off more as a crime thriller. But yeah, amazing film. Like, the acting in it is really believable as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really good. It's really gritty, kind of BBC gritty crime drama. In not a very flashy way. It's a pretty kind of unflashy film for the most part. It's just really well written, well acted. Everything just looks bleak. Do you know what I mean?
32, Don't Look Now, which there's something about that film that, again, like Kill List, it has this feeling of dread. Although it's not obviously violent like Kill List is, it still has that feeling of uncertainty in it.
Yeah, it's probably one of the least violent, gory movies on the entire list of the 50 movies we're looking at. It's pretty... not peaceful, it's because it does have this dread and this kind of melancholy to it, but there's not a lot of violence in it. It's more suggested and more kind of psychological within the characters, because the husband and wife are the center of the movie, and it's about them mourning their child that died maybe a year before the movie starts, and just kind of reckoning with that and the possibility that they might be able to find her again through a psychic that they encounter on their trip. But what a great film. It looks fantastic. The location does half the work, I think. They're in Venice in the middle of winter, so it's really kind of gloomy and beautiful and kind of bleak. And I haven't been to Venice, but I would go to Venice in the winter just for that, just to look at the city as it appears in the film.
It's funny you mentioned the melancholy as well, because I think that plays a big part in Carrie, because I think Carrie is an amazing film for so many reasons. I mean, the split screen, the direction, a lot of that is to do with sadness and also the bullying aspect of it as well. You haven't mentioned the original in your list, I don't think, not that I can see anyway, but Evil Dead 2, number 30.
I like Evil Dead. I think I like Evil Dead 2 more. I think it's weird because Evil Dead is more a traditional kind of horror movie, like straight ahead horror, and Evil Dead 2 is more comedy horror.
Yeah.
which I usually kind of don't like comedy horror for the most part. There's many exceptions to that, but Evil Dead 2 is one of the exceptions where it's funny, but it's not. I mean, it is dumb in a way because it's silly, over the top, gory humor, but it's super well done. It's well acted. The editing is really fast. There's actual scares in it. It's not just silly, dumb comedy horror. There is real horror in it, as well as crazy, over the top kind of carnage too. That kind of makes it definitely go onto my list.
I think you're right there, because I think for me, the second one feels like Sam Raimi found his feet with that franchise.
The one thing going for the first one, it has that vibe that something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre has, where it's so low budget, it makes it scarier because it's not glossy. It's very like dirty feeling and kind of low budget. It just makes it seem more real, even though we know it's not real, it's a movie. It makes it seem more real because it just seems like someone's recording this, as opposed to a high budget, glossy camera angles, special effects kind of thing.
Yeah,
do you get that vibe at all from it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it's almost like what you can't see is more terrifying, isn't it? Because of the graininess of it. I mean, it felt very grainy when I remember watching it, because obviously it was on VHS back then. It was a dodgy pirate copy more than likely as well. So that added to the scariness of it, I think. So here's a good one: 27, Spanish horror film Wreck, which blew me away when I first saw that. I thought it was so original.
Same thing. It was kind of maybe not the peak, but going towards the peak of when zombie movies and zombie TV shows were like a big deal, and everyone was making zombie films. So it's like, it's another zombie film, great. But when you start watching it, it's so great. It actually is truly scary. That was one of the very scary movies I think I've seen in my life. I really didn't know what was going to happen next. And anything could have happened next, and you go with it. It's just a wild, kind of crazy ride.
It came at a time when found footage, I think I was a little bit bored of found footage type films, horror films.
Well, the original, I think they did a bunch of American remakes, but the original is a Spanish film, and it takes place in an apartment building. Someone in the building becomes infected with this zombie virus and starts passing it to other people who live in the building. And then a film crew come in. I don't remember why the film crew, the journalist, comes into the building originally, but she comes in with kind of a fire department squad or something. For some reason, I forgot why. Maybe she's following them to like a day in the life of a fireman or something like that. Yeah. And then they get trapped in this building that the government or someone quarantines the building and ropes it off, and they won't let people leave because they know that the situation's going on inside. So all the team they can't leave the building, they can't escape, but they know more people are becoming infected in this building and are coming out of their apartments to kind of kill people and cause carnage. So that's kind of the gist of the film, right?
It's so good. It's so scary.
Yeah, it's really scary. I forgot it was found footage for a second, because I mean it's great. There's a real reason for found footage in the movie, because it's a film crew. It's not just someone holding a camera being like, I gotta stop, I gotta film the whole thing, which is kind of unrealistic. There's a reason for it, but you forget that it's found footage because it's just so good. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a clever way of incorporating found footage into the film, isn't it? They've like you say, they've got a purpose for it. 25, another really scary film, especially if you've got claustrophobia, because this is one of the most intense films. It's called The Descent at 25 on your list.
I think I knew what it was going in. I knew it was about cave exploration, which scares me. If the movie was just about cave exploration alone, I would be terrified, because that's what the first half of the movie at least is, just this group of women who go exploring. They're just, what's the term for spelunking? Is that the term for cave exploring?
I think so, yeah.
And they go deeper into this cave system, and they start getting lost and kind of trapped in certain passageways, and passageways get smaller and smaller, and then there's like cave-ins and all that kind of stuff. That alone is terrifying. And then you find out there's creatures that live in these caves, deep in, like human, maybe at one time human, turned into zombie, unknown, weird creatures. So it's like already terrifying, and then it gets another level of terrifying, and it's super gory, really bloody. The ending is also kind of bleak, and it's really scary.
It's really clever because people seem to forget, there are other fears apart from obviously being scared of ghosts or ghouls or zombies, demons. Like, you've got the fears that are in some ways more like normal. And claustrophobia, I mean, there aren't many people that wouldn't find that idea just like one of the worst things that could possibly happen to you. Not only are you down, hundreds of feet down or whatever, but you've got to come across these creatures as well. So yeah, it's brilliant. It's a brilliant concept. Number 21, House of the Devil, made in 2009, but actually you think it's made much earlier because it's got that real retro feel about it. I was really surprised to see this on the list, not because I'm surprised that it's in there in your favourite films, but I completely forgotten about this film and how I actually watched it not knowing when it was made and thinking it was a really old film.
Yeah, I mean, I think that might be the choice of the director to make it feel like a late 70s, early 80s. I mean, it does with the fonts and just like this, all the stuff. It takes place in an unknown time period, but it's supposed to be the early 80s, maybe. They don't really explain what time it is. It's about a woman who's kind of broke and she's trying to make money. So I think she's a college student, and she agrees to do a job for a night, kind of babysitting an elderly person in a house, in an old, creepy mansion type house. And she's there by herself, and this person is, in their bedroom not to be disturbed, and things go crazy, as you can imagine, when she starts exploring the house. And it's by Ty West, who did the movie X and Pearl, which both came out this year.
And yeah, I love Pearl.
Yeah, I think I like Pearl the most of X and Pearl as a duo. It's so great. He clearly loves doing kind of period films and kind of films that kind of like Tarantino, that reference his favorite movies from the past and kind of trying to do a new spin on it. But yeah, House of the Devil is great. I always recommend that film for people who want something they haven't heard of, because I don't think it did very well. It was kind of like a little kind of underground indie film, but such a great horror movie. I
saw X obviously first, as you're meant to, because it was made before, but obviously Pearl is the prequel to X, and now I've seen Pearl, I kind of want to go back to X again, because I thought X was really creepy, but Pearl had a different feel about it.
Yeah, Pearl is such a great film. I don't know if it did well or not, if it kind of was critically acclaimed or not, but I thought it was really great. I thought Mia Goth, who's kind of seems to be a new Jamie Lee Curtis horror actress who's kind of doing all these horror movies now, she's so great in Pearl.
And that closing scene where the credits are rolling. Yeah. I know everybody's talking about that, but she's so brilliant. And she doesn't have to say anything.
She gives a monologue at the end of the movie that's probably more than 5 minutes long of just her talking to someone. And it's great. What a great actress.
We've got It Follows at 19, which I have to say, when I first saw it at the cinema, when it came out, I thought it was a bit reductive. I think it was authentic in the way that it was made. You could tell that the director really genuinely loved a lot of horror films. But for me, it felt like it was copying other films. But now I've seen it, it has stayed with me, and I want to go back and see it again. And I can totally see why it's, really popular with the critics and with horror fans.
For me, I agree with that. And it has this kind of strange vibe, like you said, where you feel like you've seen it before. But I felt like it was being inspired by a bunch of films I like from like maybe the early 80s or something, but I couldn't pinpoint which ones they were. Do you know which ones you kind of felt a vibe from?
The swimming pool scene reminded me of Let the Right One In.
The end of the movie, yeah.
I think Halloween, or maybe a lot of John Carpenter films with the score specifically, but yeah, those are the only two I can think of, but I at the time I just remember there being more, but I don't know, maybe I just wasn't in the right frame of mind to see it and appreciate it for what it was, but
it has that vibe we were talking about before, about kind of like a melancholy vibe where it's just like a maybe suburban neighborhood or something, and you kind of follow these teenagers walking around and you sense something terrible is going to happen, but nothing's really happening at the moment. It just has this kind of dread that kind of like follows them, and that's the name of the movie, but like it follows them around even when they're like lying around sitting in someone's living room just talking. It's something terrible is going to happen soon.
So at 10 then, Suspiria, not the original Suspiria, because that is lower on your list. I was like gooped, I was gagged when I read this list. It's like, how can you put the remake? But when I saw I say remake, it's kind of like a reboot, isn't it, rather than a remake, because it's more original. But I remember seeing it really early. It was an early morning screening at one of the film festivals, and it was like 8 a.m. or something. It's like almost a 3-hour film, isn't it? So I felt a bit like my brain was fried when I came out of it.
That's a movie that actually I've seen multiple times, and every time I've seen it, it gets better and better. Because it's like you said, it's really long. It's probably 2.5 hours, something like that. It's very, very dense film. There's a bunch of characters in the film, tons of different scenes, tons of backstory. The first half of it, there's not a lot of like horror to it. It's just kind of like that, once again, that feeling of dread where you know it's building towards something, but you don't know what it is. The design, the costume design, production design, cinematography is all totally beautiful. Just looks amazing. And it's so interesting that to do a remake, he went the opposite. Usually people just copy what the original was, but he went the opposite, where the original is super colorful and bright, over the top, crazy coloring. I mean, that's like Argento movies in the 70s are all just like primary color, bright, crazy lighting. This is completely just devoid of those color and sapped out and very 70s looking. I mean, that's the setting. It's very gray and bleak. It's like Berlin in the 70s, so of course it's not going to be candy colored and that kind of vibe, but I just think it's fantastic. The score is really great by Tom York. Great acting. Tilda Swinton can walk into a movie and kind of elevate it just by her presence, just kind of standing around. And
I agree with that. I got to say, your top 10 is almost identical to mine. We'll talk about Black Christmas, which is your number 3 favourite horror film, 1974. I mean, God, so much to say about this film. Again, really gritty and raw, isn't it? It just feels really grubby. I felt quite dirty the first time I saw it. I've seen it countless times since, usually, obviously, at Christmas. It comes around every year. My other half's like, do we have to watch it again? But we do.
Yeah, I have to watch it because they did a Blu-ray of it, so it's like, it looks even better. But yeah, what a great film. Lots of people say it's the original Halloween, where it's a slasher where you can't... Unlike Halloween, you don't ever see the killer. He just remains kind of faceless the entire time and off camera. It does have that 70s gritty, kind of ugly vibe where it's just like bad clothes and bad decor. And if you're a kid of our generation watching it now, it just seems really like dowdy and kind of frumpy. At the same time, it has really glamorous people like Olivia Hussey playing the main character and Margot Kidder.
I know!
Wearing a velvet necklace with the word yes on it in diamonds. Do you remember that?
Amazing.
Which if you have like the cleaned up Blu-ray version, because the original just looks kind of blurry, but in the cleaned up version, she has yes on her necklace and just kind of getting drunk at a party and just being like sassy and bratty to a bunch of people. She's great in that movie.
So your number 1 movie then, exactly the same as mine, Halloween, not the 2018 version of Halloween, the the Rob Zombie one.
Yeah.
1978. Oh my God.
Why don't you start and tell me why it means so much and why it was so powerful?
Okay, so I saw it when I was, I think I said earlier, and I was about 8 or 9. I think it had been on TV really soon after the cinema release. I think it was like 2 or 3 years after, and I remember going to school the next day and everybody was talking about it. All the kids in my class had seen it as well, but I just remember having nightmares for weeks afterwards, but being just totally captivated by the film. And I loved the score. I think it was the score that had such a powerful effect for me. I mean, it really did start my obsession with John Carpenter films, because I've loved so many of his since. The Thing and The Fog, my favourite films, apart from Halloween, obviously in that top 10 as well. The fact that you don't really see too much either, that really spooked me. It's the fact that you're imagining a lot of it rather than actually seeing it on the screen. I just thought it was, I mean, he's the master of suspense, the master of horror.
Everything you just said is everything I would say too. And the fact that is such a great statement of how fantastic the movie is and how powerful is that you're a kid growing up in the UK and I'm growing up in the US, and we have the same experience where we both see it young, both go to school, everyone's seen it, everyone's talking about it, everyone's scared at the same things. What you said about the score is great too, because it's kind of like the score of Jaws, where it's really simple, but because it's simple, you can just mouth it and everyone knows what you're talking about, like the Jaws creeping sound of like the shark coming. And the piano in Halloween, like everyone
So
knows what
memorable.
that is. Yeah, it's simple and effective, right?
Gotta say, the cinematography and the lighting, I mean, now I'm older, I can appreciate that more, but at the time it still had an effect on me, because you see, like, the trees blowing in the wind, but you almost see the light bouncing off the trees, so you don't actually see too much, obviously. And there are scenes with Michael Myers, that scene where he's standing amongst the washing line. And there's just so many moments that I still remember, but just completely freaked out by as a kid, and just thinking they were really effective. It's like when Laurie's in the classroom and she's looking out onto the road and you see him behind the car, standing there, and then he's gone, he's vanished. And it's so simple but so effective.
It's effective too because I think at that time, I mean, we saw it a couple years after it came out. It was very original, and no one had made a character. I mean, if you made a movie like Halloween now, everyone's seen Michael Myers, everyone's seen Jason and Freddy Krueger, so you have to dig really deep to find something that's an original visual. But back in '78, a guy in like a jumpsuit wearing a white mask was probably a new concept or a new look. So everyone was just like, I've never seen this before. It's terrifying if I ever saw that person in real life. And that's really effective to me. And a really effective thing is that Jamie Lee Curtis, who's really great, I think this is one of her first movie roles that she did. You get to sit with her character for a long time, enough to like really care about what happens to her. And she's kind of like a nerdy, kind of like quiet teenager, but she's really likable and you really care about her experience. So when she starts going through the actual horror elements at the end of the movie, you're really rooting for her to escape and like kill him and get rid of him and protect the kids and stuff. And there are a lot of horror movies, that modern ones, where if you don't, the characters are really bratty or obnoxious or kind of terrible, just people you don't give a crap about. So when they're getting killed, you're like, whatever.
You don't care. Yeah, you kind of want them to die quicker in some ways.
Exactly, get the next one. But with Laurie, John Carpenter built a character, and Deborah Hill is the co-writer, built the character that you actually care about. So when things start to go crazy, you get invested in it, where I feel like there's certain horror movies you're just not invested. If you're not invested in the character, you don't care about the stakes at the end of the movie. But in Halloween, you completely do.
Matt, it's been so great chatting to you. This has been really fun. I hope it's been fun for you as well.
Oh, yeah, it's been great.
So good luck with your band MICROFILM. Tell us where everyone can find you on social media and they can buy your tunes.
Sure. You can buy the tunes. Our website the de facto website is microfilm.bandcamp.com. So it's a Bandcamp site, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard of Bandcamp. It's also streaming everywhere. It's on, it's on Apple, it's on Spotify, it's on all those streaming services. It's in every digital music store. If you're one of the people left who still buys MP3s and buys albums digitally, we're on all those stores available. We're on social media and Instagram and Twitter at MICROFILM Music. You can find us and follow us and chat with us. Hopefully you can check out the music. Our new album's called OVNI, OVNI. We hope you like it, definitely.
Check it out, guys, because their music is great, and we'll put all the links down below as well. So click on the links, buy the tunes, chat on social media. Matt, so good to talk to you, and thank you so much for coming on. We'll talk horror soon, hopefully.
Oh yeah, hopefully.
Thanks for watching, everyone.